Hello there, this is All 24 News, special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Fazakri, coming to you live from Algiers. Here's what's on tap today. The cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Ukraine's two footholds in the eastern Luhansk region, are the sites of hellish battles against Russia, Regional Governor Serhiy Haidai said. Moscow's forces are gathering near a village south of Lysychansk that was captured this week, he said, in a possible attempt to cut off the remaining defense there. Russian missile attacks continue to hit the rest of Ukraine, with strikes reported near Kharkiv and the north and Mykolaiv in the south. European Union leaders meeting Thursday granted Ukraine candidate status, a symbolic win for Kiev amid its war with Russia and the formal start of a process to join the bloc that could take decades. Heads of states and government backed candidacy for Ukraine and Moldova, but asked both countries to meet certain conditions before they move on to the next steps. To talk more about these developments and more, and other pressing issues, that is, I am joined live via Skype by Mustafa Karisei, an assistant professor of Homeland Security at DeSales University and a content editor in NATO Veterans Associations from USA. And from Italy, joining us live is Lowe, a geopolitical analyst and a member of advisory board at Pyramid Teme Group. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. A short break and we start. So before delving into any discussion, I guess it's fine if we share some updates after weeks of bombardment and battles in the east. Let's commence with you, Professor Mustafa Karisei. If we say that the Russian troops succeeded and could manage to take control over the eastern part of the country in general and the Donbas region precisely, what would be the next move? Will Russia keep on moving toward another target, or it will stop over that region and make it a Russian land for good?
I think, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk regions are very important cities in the Donbas area. I think it's a very important gain. But I think Severodonetsk is a very, it's flat. So Lysychansk area, the second target, so it has a very complex terrain. So I think Russians will have a very difficult time in capturing that specific territory. So because it will allow Ukrainians to have multiple defensive positions, I think it will probably take more time to capture Lysychansk. In addition to Lysychansk, another industrial center is the Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk is the other industrial center, and the Russians probably will target that area after capturing the Lysychansk. But the problem is, as they approach, as they go to west, Ukrainians will fight, more fiercely because they have better defensive positions. So I think it's an important step. It's an important gain for Russians after Mariupol. But I would say that the Russians probably will have to spend more time and spend more effort to capture Lysychansk, as well as the other industrial center as they approach the west, I think.
Perhaps they're going slowly, but surely they're taking more and more lands. What do you think can actually stop them, Professor Mustafa Karisei?
Well, I think one of the major issues is the complex terrain. Some areas like Severodonetsk, for example, is easier for Russians to fight. But as I emphasized, Lysychansk has complex terrain. Another difficulty of Russians, I think, is personnel. While the Ukrainians are suffering from, ammunition issues, weapons issues, Russians are suffering from the personnel issues, especially training. So BBC recently reported that the new recruits of Russians, so they are facing training issues. They don't have sufficient training, so which actually causes issues in terms of fighting in the urban terrain. Also, the public support for within Russia is just 8% or 10% for this Ukraine invasion. So I think one of the major difficulties is the personnel issues and the training, and the second issue is the complex terrain, as we will see that in the Lysychansk area. And I think the final issue, as they go to west, we will see the Ukrainians will fight fiercely. So one of the Ukrainian medic officers, they said that this is a tactical withdrawal. Severodonetsk, from withdrawing from that area, is a tactical withdrawal because it is taking too much time for them to evacuate their wounded soldiers to safe area. So they don't want to lose more people. So they said that it's a tactical withdrawal. So we will see probably more fierce fighting in Lishan area, in the last industrial centers in Kramatorsk over the west.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. Mr. Markler, if Ukraine could save its eastern part of the country from the Russians, would that be safe enough to secure the whole country? Or there will be always measures to be taken for better and strong protection? If so, what kind of protection it could be provided without being a NATO member?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to reason in terms of it being, as much as this is, as I say, very, very unlikely that Ukraine is going to be able to protect, far less maintain, the eastern regions. That said, where Ukraine...
Mm-hmm. Seems that we're having a connection problem with Mark Lowe for the moment. Perhaps you could answer the question, Mustafa Kurisi.
Repeat the question one more time, please.
Yes, I was saying that what kind of protection could Ukraine be provided with without being a NATO member?
Well, one of the major protections is the military aid being sent currently to Ukraine. Also, currently the EU membership is going on, so there's a significant EU backing as well as UK and the US backing for Ukraine. But this still doesn't necessarily mean that they will have to involve directly in this conflict, because the Ukraine is obviously not a NATO member. So there is no formal protection for Ukraine to secure the entire Donbass area. Recently, U.S. Defense Minister said that so they actually are considering the possibility that Ukraine may not necessarily win the war, because in April, for example, they said that they believe that Ukraine will win, but now they revised their position in a way that there might be a possibility that the Ukraine may lose the eastern Donbass, the eastern Ukraine area, the entire Donbass. So I think they are considering this possibility. Recently, Boris Johnson said that there's a Ukrainian fatigue. So there's a protection, but these protections are in the form of sending more military aid, sending more people from Western countries, providing political cover, for example. But other than that, there is no formal protection because Ukraine is not a NATO member. And I think in Western countries now, they are also considering the possibility that Ukraine may lose Donbass area. That's not 100%, absolutely. That doesn't mean they're going to lose eastern Donbass area, but there's a possibility too.
Yeah, there is a big possibility indeed. Mr. Markler is back with us. Perhaps you could resume what you were saying, Mr. Markler, since we lost the connection with you. Mr. Markler, can you hear me? Apparently, Mr. Markler cannot hear me for the moment, so perhaps we move on and then we get back to fix that problem. Moving on, another question that comes in mind. Ukraine's President Zelensky said earlier last month that only diplomacy can end the war in Ukraine. At the same time, now he is still calling the Western allies to keep delivering weapons, and he keeps encouraging his soldiers to fight until the end. Some people might see this as a contradiction in Zelensky's actions. So, Mr. Mustafa Kurisi, what is your comment about that?
So I think it was Putin who actually rejected talking to Zelensky. Zelensky actually, at the very beginning of the conflict, he offered to talking to Putin, but Putin rejected and still rejecting. I think in terms of negotiation, we see that each side has very strict position. While Ukraine, for example, was so...
We lost the sound of Mr. Karim. Karima, are you there? All right, moving on. The European Union agreed Thursday to put Ukraine and Moldova on a path toward EU membership and granted them EU candidate status. However, EU candidate status doesn't give an automatic right to join the bloc and doesn't provide any immediate security guarantees. According to EU's criteria, the EU candidate countries would need to meet accession conditions to be able to join the bloc, including on issues relating to justice, anti-corruption mechanisms, and rule of law. Among others, or member states were initially divided on how quickly the bloc should accept Ukraine as a member, with the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark among the most skeptical.
We have decided to grant candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and we are ready to grant candidate status to Georgia once priorities will be addressed.
This is a very defining moment and a very good day for Europe today. I warmly congratulate President Zelensky, President Sandu, President Zurabishvili. All three countries are part of our European family. We've never let any doubt about that. And today's historic decision by leaders confirms that.
So back to you, Mr. Markler, before I ask you questions about the EU. Mr. Markler, you may resume your answer.
Yes, good afternoon.
Yes. Mr. Markler?
Yeah, just very quick.
Yes, you were answering the question regarding the NATO defense system in Ukraine.
Yes, I would agree almost entirely, Doctor, with the exception of my doubt, Ukraine will manage to hold the Donbas region. I think this is extremely unlikely. We have to be very realistic. And I think we simply have to project our heads into the future, envisage a Ukraine that has lost a huge part of its territory. That said, where some form of miracle to intervene.
We're still having the same connection problem with Mr. Markler. So regarding the EU, Mustafa Kreisi, EU says that Ukraine is a democratic country since the citizens are the ones who voted for President Zelensky, and since the latter is one of the criteria to join EU. Do you think that Ukraine meets all the EU's criteria? And do you think Ukraine and Moldova really deserve to be granted the EU membership according to the known criteria?
Can you hear me now? Just checking.
Yes, I can hear you, Mr.
Okay.
Mustafa Karim.
Okay,
Did you hear my question?
Yeah, I heard. Yeah. In terms of this EU membership, I think it is very symbolic because now this decision is, although it's important, it is important to send a message that Europe is behind Ukraine, because the major goal of this membership process, this decision, is to send a message to Russia that when they attack a country like Ukraine, or when they use aggressive military action, there will be a price. And the price will be that it will backlash. It will backlash in a way that Europe will exert more influence over the countries where Russia had influence before. I think this is just a symbolic move. In terms of the process, so this doesn't mean, this decision doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine will be a member, because it will take like decades. Because the average time until a member country becomes, average time a candidate country becomes a member, is 7 to 8 years. So recently, Romania, Bulgaria, for example, it took 10 or 11 years. Cyprus, 13 years. So it will be a very long, lengthy, and cumbersome process. In terms of whether or not democracy in Ukraine will help them to be a member, there's clearly a corruption issue in Ukraine. So they have to fix it. And then in any point, these negotiations may stall. And secondly, Ukraine has to restore their country after the war. So I think there are some issues within Ukrainian democracy, but I think it's an important move. So this move will probably embolden Zelensky to make democratic reforms within Ukraine, but all these will probably have to happen after the war.
What about you, Mr. Markler? Do you think Ukraine really deserves to be granted the EU membership, saying that perhaps it overcomes all the issues that it has? Mr. Markler?
Quite frankly, no, I don't. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Working? Good. Quite frankly, I disagree with the concept of granting this first step towards European Union membership, for the simple fact that I don't understand the requirement. Now, at this precise moment, Europe has already done everything that it can to show a form of solidarity for the Ukraine. At this precise time, President Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, and the as a whole, has far more pressing issues to deal with than European Union member to this. In all honesty, I find it very, very hard to believe that European Union leadership is still reality, the thoughts and the citizens. If we stop 10 European citizens on the street and ask them their opinion, 9 out of 10 people would simply...
I guess it's impossible to carry on like this. Perhaps I ask from the technical team to call back Mr. Mark Lowe. Continuing with you, Mustafa Karisei, Georgia has been ruled since decades by oligarchs, and no ex-politician Bidzna, the billionaire founder of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, who kind of has a strong tie with Russians. Do you think this letter will be an obstacle to grant Georgia the EU application? Taking into consideration one of the EU rules is the Olgarization, or de-Olgarization. That's a difficult word to pronounce. Yes, Mr. Karib?
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm not saying that it will be a direct obstacle to an EU membership, but this is an indication that these types of post-Soviet countries and all the countries where Russia have influence currently. So they have this oligarchization issue as well as a corruption issue, and it will probably cause more issues down the road. So this decision is, although emboldening Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, but this even doesn't mean that these countries will start negotiations, because all of the countries, EU has a very strict mechanism in terms of decision making. So these countries, all the European member countries, will have to decide whether or not these 3 countries will start negotiations, just a negotiation. And after starting the negotiation, then these 3 countries will have to check the boxes in Copenhagen criteria. And after checking the boxes, carrying out all the criteria and their tasks, then all the member countries will have to sign off. And then once they decide that these countries will be a member, then they can be a member. So it's a very long and cumbersome process, and then EU countries, probably member countries, will consider this letter. But I don't think it is just the one obstacle, because European Union is focusing more on the democratic structure, democratic reforms, how well they are making progress towards this goal. I think they are looking at the overall picture rather than just a single letter.
But Mr. Karim, I would like to raise this question as well. Europe's unity over the war in Ukraine is at risk as public attention increasingly shifts from the battlefield to cost of living concerns. A survey in 9 EU member states found that despite strong support across Europe for Ukraine's bid to join the EU and the West's policy of cutting ties with Moscow, many voters in Europe want the war to end as soon as possible, even if that means Ukraine losing more territory. What are you saying about that?
Well, definitely, there is a public support in terms of ending the war, but I would say, the vast majority of people are still supporting Ukraine in fighting. Mm-hmm. In terms of economic issues, for example, these issues are not necessarily related to war, because some of the issues actually are related to COVID and supply chain issues. So there's a public support for ending the war, but this doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine has to, make a concession from their own territories.
Because according to the data that exists right now, it seems that any kind of peace deal would mean Ukraine would lose more, let's say, territory, because Russia doesn't have any intention of ending the war anytime soon, don't you think?
Yeah, like I said before, the Western countries are considering the possibility that Ukraine may have to lose territory. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, they will have to make a concession, because when we look at the Ukrainian position, they are very strict. They're very strict in terms of not relinquishing any territory, including Crimea, to Russia. Even if the Zelensky government accepts making concession, it will be dependent on the referendum. And I don't think the majority of Ukrainians will probably accept making concession to Russia after these war atrocities committed by Russian forces. So in terms of divisions, I think it is probably it is dependent on how long Europe will sustain this war. Because currently, they are accepting the economic costs, particularly gas, like natural gas dependency and oil. So they are looking for alternatives. But as we approach the winter, then they will have to make a choice. They will have to make a choice in a way that they will either, keep sending more military aid to Ukraine, or they will find a way to talk to Putin in order to end the conflict, maybe with a negotiated settlement. So today, for example, in Germany, they declared that they are having gas shortages, because Russia cut gas supplies by 60%. So, and we will see probably this 60% will increase maybe 80, maybe 90% over the next several months as we approach the winter. I think for now there is a unification. I wouldn't say there is a significant division, although there are some differences, for example, in terms of how the war should end, how the war should end. Macron, for example, is having some issues with other leaders and actually has some communication channels with Putin. Germany is thinking differently. UK is more hawkish, along with US. So there are differences in terms of
that's
how
what
the war should
the government is trying to
But in general,
portray.
I would say there is a unification, because all of these leaders are backing.
Perhaps Mr. Mark Lowe has a different opinion about that. Mr. Mark Lowe, do you think Europe's unity over the war in Ukraine is at risk as public attention increasingly shifts from the battlefield to the cost of living?
Certainly. I don't believe for a moment that European citizens will continue to support the assistance that's been given and will be given for quite a while yet to Ukraine. We have a problem here where, on the one hand, leadership of the European Union has taken a series of fairly radical decisions, including granting Ukraine the opportunity to begin the membership process, which defies logic, given the fact that currently Ukraine has far more serious problems to address, such as a war actually happening on Ukrainian territory. I don't understand why there's any urgency to begin a process focused on becoming a member of the... But the big issue is that the cost of living, the cost of staples, the cost of energy, the cost of living is increasing dramatically throughout Europe. This is not entirely due to the crisis in the Ukraine. We have to be very honest about this. However, the situation in Ukraine has a massive impact. And in Europe, and I think European leadership tends to forget this, the economy is not progressing at all well, and has not been progressing at all well for a great years. Our economies are stagnating. Our living costs are increasing dramatically. Our wages, the average citizen takes home the same amount of money as they were taking home 5-6 years ago, but living costs have increased, inflation is increasing. It's very, very difficult for a number of the European citizens to smile and to have any good reason for feeling optimistic. So, to answer the question precisely, no, I don't believe that European citizens will continue to support a policy based on doing all possible to advance Ukrainian objectives.
So how convenient is the pretext of the war for covering for the failures, economic failures of the West, especially that every single time this issue comes to the surface of, let's say, the West creating this problem or this food crisis or the economic crisis that is sensed by the average EU citizens who are still complaining, and due to which the support to Ukraine is going to be lost, Mr. Markler?
It is obvious that Europe as a bloc is missing a series of very, very fundamental policies. If we wish to tell the absolute truth, the European Union is not a union at all. It's some form of condominium with different inhabitants, all of which share a few things in common, but all of which have their own ideas, their own policies, their own strategies. If we look at energy strategy, there is no such thing as a common European energy strategy. Each nation has its own strategies, and each nation has been absolutely brilliant in making mistake after mistake after mistake. And the list goes on. What Europe is absolutely lacking is joined up thinking. So hence the reason why I find it very, very hard to believe that it's a good idea to be further expanding a union, which is a condominium, rather than a union. And there will be, without a shadow of doubt, a lot of reticence on the part of the European citizens.
Based on your highlights, Mr. Mustafa Kurisi, what are the priorities that the EU should focus on right now?
I think the major priority is ending this war, because first time European Union offered this candidacy status to a country which is at war in the full scale. So the first priority should be to end the war and then allow.
But Mr. Mustafa Kurisi, seeing the nature of the EU bloc, which is economic mainly, how could ending the war be a priority through more sanctions? As we can see that the sanctions are not really working, and they are indeed backfiring. I mean, the average EU citizens are feeling that.
So Vladimir Putin has recently said that the economic sanctions will have a significant impact on the Russian economy on the long term. So it is actually not realistic, based on the sanction literature in political science. So it is not realistic to expect that these sanctions will work in the short term. In the long term, even Vladimir Putin is recognizing that these sanctions will have an impact. In terms of, backfiring issue, some of the issues like inflation, the Federal Reserve in the United States said that the head of the Federal Reserve said that war is not necessarily a cause of inflation, because the inflation issue and other cost of living issues are related to COVID and supply chain issues. So I think we have to distinguish the problems related to natural gas and oil, and also the cost of living. So I think in terms of imposing more sanctions, the Western countries have to impose more sanctions in order to prevent Russia from, doing such violations, because violating the territorial integrity is a major violation of the international law. So imposing sanctions is basically to deter Russia from doing the things currently they are doing. So I think that's necessary. But on the other hand, I would argue that the negotiation channels should be open. So, for example, we can criticize Emmanuel Macron in terms of his domestic policy, but he at least has some communication channels with Putin. I would argue that in addition to imposing sanctions, there should be some sort of communication channels that should be open, and then European leaders or UK or the United States, so they should have some sort of communication channels directly with Putin or Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, in order to find a middle ground. Otherwise, just keep sending military aid may not necessarily end the conflict, because we see on the ground that Russia is making advancements and Ukraine is neutralizing these advancements as they get more weapons, modern artillery, long-range missiles, but we see a stalemate here. So I think in the long term, in addition to imposing sanctions, I think this is necessary now, because the international community has to show a price to Russia. But negotiation channels should also be open, and Europe, I think, should sustain doing that, especially Emmanuel Macron and Germany.
Clear, Mr. Mustafa Kurisi. Mr. Mark Lowe, how ready is the EU to do without Russia, according to you?
the European Union is not ready to do without Russia. We're seeing this on a day-to-day basis. It's very, very simple. We, as I mentioned earlier, have a severe lack of joined-up thinking. We also have a severe lack of scenario planning. We have a situation where each single European nation goes ahead from day to day without any clear plan. As regards the current situation, there is no desired outcome, shared desired outcome at all. There is no, from what I have seen, I may be wrong, I can't have eyes and ears everywhere, but there is no scenario planning for the day after this conflict comes to an end. So Europe on the whole, despite being a major shareholder, because when I'm supplying support, whatever type it may be, I am a shareholder, and therefore by definition I have the right to influence the outcome of the scenario that I am involved in. And there is no clear idea. Each European nation goes ahead on its own. The United Kingdom, let's not even talk about it.
Just as a striking example, Mr. Mark Lowe, is it possible to say that Germany, as any other EU member countries, are responsible for the crisis their countries are facing? I mean, they backed up Ukraine and cut ties with Moscow without having an alternative, such as Italy. Do you think that Germany is under pressure that it risks its own benefit?
Well, of course we can argue that not only Germany, but every other country that's suffering from this scenario only has itself to blame. You made the comparison with Italy. Italy is not out of the woods yet. Italy has not resolved the problem at all. Italy has simply done everything within its possibilities to find emergency solutions, but these are not long-term solutions. So we are all absolutely responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in today. And that is due, on the one hand, to the huge amount of freedom and the huge amount of influence that, for example, oil companies have and energy companies have in the various single states. And if we look specifically at Europe, a complete and absolute and categorical lack of joined-up thinking of a common policy. So yes, we are absolutely responsible for the situation we find ourselves in today.
We have reached the end, unfortunately. We ran out of time. Thank you, dear guest, for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.